My name is Nadia Prescott. I'm 38 years old, and 4 months ago, I sat across a conference table on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville that I own a 31% stake in, and I watched my father slide his resume across the polished surface toward me with the careful, studied movements of a man attempting to look casual while doing the hardest thing he has ever done in his life. The resume was 2 pages, laser printed, still slightly warm at the edges, like he'd fed it through a printer that morning in whatever motel or cousin's spare room he was currently calling home. His name sat at the top in clean, bold type. Dennis Ray Prescott, 59 years old, 22 years of experience in residential construction management. References available upon request. I looked at that resume for a long time without speaking. I looked at my father's hands resting on the table beside it. Large, work-roughened, permanently calloused in the specific way of a man who spent decades doing physical work and considered that fact the central credential of his worth. The same hands that, on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2005, had taken a letter from the University of Tennessee's Office of Financial Aid and torn it in half down the middle, cleanly and deliberately, while I stood in our kitchen in Clarksville, Tennessee, and watched the 2 pieces flutter separately onto the linoleum floor. I was 18 years old. I had worked for that letter for 4 years. I want to tell you this story from the beginning because the beginning is where the shape of everything lives, and you cannot understand a conference room in 2025 without understanding a kitchen in 2005. You cannot understand what it meant for Dennis Prescott to slide his resume across my table without understanding what it meant for him to tear that letter in half in front of his daughter and call it parenting. And I need you to understand it, because I know some of you are standing in your own kitchen right now, watching someone tear something, telling yourself it isn't as bad as it feels. I need you to know that it is exactly as bad as it feels, and that the kitchen is not the last room in your story. Before I go further, if this is already landing close to something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, only if it genuinely resonates. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are when these words find you. For as long as I can remember, my father Dennis Prescott was a man who had built a complete and internally consistent worldview out of the materials of his own limitations and then furnished every room of our family's life with it. He was not a stupid man. I want to be clear about that because this story is not about a stupid man. Stupid men are almost easier to navigate because their damage is less precisely targeted. Dennis was intelligent, practically, mechanically, spatially intelligent, in the way of someone who could look at a structural problem and solve it without writing anything down. He could read a building site the way other people read a room. He understood load-bearing walls and drainage gradients and the specific language of contractors and subcontractors and city inspectors. And he was good at his work in the way that people who love a thing are good at it. What Dennis could not do, would not do, and had organized an entire philosophy to avoid doing, was imagine that intelligence took more than one form. His form was the valid one. Other forms, the kind that lived in books, in universities, in offices above the 3rd floor, in careers that required sitting down, were either soft, overrated, or outright fraudulent. This was not a casual opinion. It was a doctrine, and he preached it with the consistency and conviction of a man who had decided the best defense against the world's judgment of his choices was to delegitimize the standards by which those choices might be judged. College was a scam. This was his foundational text. He said it the way other fathers said grace, regularly, ritually, with the assurance of someone repeating something true. College was where soft people went to pay enormous amounts of money to be told things that didn't matter by people who had never done real work, and to come out the other side with debt and an inflated sense of their own importance that made them useless in actual life. He had not gone to college. He had gone directly from high school in 1984 into construction work, and he had built a career with his hands, and he made decent money and owned his tools outright and answered to no one in a corner office, and if that wasn't success, then success was a rigged game. There was enough truth in his argument to make it dangerous. That's the thing about ideologies built on genuine grievance. They have a load-bearing wall of actual experience that makes the whole structure feel solid even when the rest of it is unsound. Dennis had real reasons to distrust institutions. He had watched his father work himself to exhaustion for a company that laid him off at 52. He had watched neighbors take out second mortgages for their kids' degrees and spend years anxious about the debt. He had watched enough college-educated project managers make decisions on job sites that any experienced laborer could have told them were wrong. His skepticism was not invented from nothing. But skepticism that begins as self-protection has a way of calcifying into something less honest, and by the time I was old enough to understand what my father believed, his skepticism had calcified into a rule that applied specifically and most heavily to me. Not to my brother Kyle, who was 2 years older and had no particular interest in academics, and who my father regarded with the uncomplicated affection of a man recognizing his own reflection. Kyle was always going to work with his hands, the way Dennis had, and this was treated as a natural and admirable trajectory that required no defense. I was different. I read constantly. I did well in school with the specific, slightly embarrassing thoroughness of a girl who genuinely loved learning and hadn't yet learned to hide it. I asked questions in class and took notes in the margins of my textbooks and had a 10th grade English teacher named Mrs. Patricia Okafor who told me in October of my sophomore year that I had a college-level analytical mind and that I should be thinking seriously about universities. I brought that comment home like a small, bright object. I showed it to my mother, Linda, who smiled and said, "That's wonderful, honey," in the voice she used for things she was genuinely pleased about but couldn't fully protect. I did not tell my father. I had already learned by 15 which information was safe to carry into which rooms. My mother, Linda, was a woman I loved and understood and cannot fully excuse, which is a complicated sentence to write about a person you love. She worked as a dental hygienist, steadily and without complaint, for 23 years at the same practice on Madison Street in Clarksville. She was warm and capable, and she had looked at Nadia Prescott at 22 and made a calculation that she later told me, in her careful way, she had not fully examined before making. She was not unhappy exactly. She was adjusted, which is a different thing. She had learned to root her ambitions, for herself and then for her children, through channels that didn't intersect with Dennis's philosophy, which meant quietly and with minimal announcement. She saved money in an account Dennis didn't know about. She bought me books and told my father they were from the library. She attended every parent-teacher conference without mentioning them at home. She loved me fiercely within the specific constraints of a life she had agreed to and was too loyal to formally contest. She was the one who brought in the mail on that Tuesday in March of 2005. She was the one who put the letter from the University of Tennessee on the kitchen table. She knew what it was. We had both known it was coming, and she had timed its placement for an afternoon when she hoped Dennis would be tired from work and therefore less reactive. She was wrong about the tired part. Dennis was home early that day, a fact neither of us had planned for, and he was in the kitchen when I came in from school, and the letter was sitting on the table between us, and he was already holding it. He had already opened it. He read it. He read it for long enough that I understood he had read it fully, absorbed what it said. Full academic scholarship, $24,000 annually, room and board included, 4 years. University of Tennessee, Knoxville, College of Arts and Sciences. He read it, and then he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of a man who had decided something before the evidence was fully in. And he tore it down the middle and put both halves on the table and said, "College is a scam, Nadia. I'm not letting you waste 4 years of your life on a scam." I looked at the two halves of the letter on the table. I looked at my father. I was 18 years old, and I had worked since the age of 14 to earn that piece of paper, and it was in 2 pieces on our kitchen linoleum, and my father was looking at me like he expected my agreement. I did not agree. But I was 18 and I lived in his house, and the world outside it felt, in that moment, very large and very indifferent, and I did not yet know what I know now, which is that the kitchen was not the last room in my story. Let me give you the structure of my childhood in the specific and concrete way it deserves, because the specific and concrete is always harder to dismiss than the general. and I spent enough years having my experiences reframed as oversensitivity to have developed a preference for precision. My brother Kyle is 2 years older than me. Kyle is a decent person. I want to say that clearly and mean it, because Kyle's role in this story is one of accidental beneficiary rather than active antagonist, and those two things are not the same. Kyle benefited from being male and from being the first child and from reflecting my father's self-image back at him with minimal distortion, and he did not design any of those advantages, and he has, in the years since we both left that house, demonstrated a genuine, if belated, awareness of what those advantages cost me. But the pattern existed, and it was real, and Kyle was its primary beneficiary. When Kyle was 16, my father took him to job sites on weekends. Not as labor, as education. Dennis walked him through the sites explaining things. Foundation work, framing, electrical rough-ins, the sequencing of a build. He talked to Kyle like an apprentice, like a young person whose future was being actively shaped by an experienced hand. These Saturday mornings were sacred in their way. Just the two of them, Dennis's truck, the specific early morning energy of a construction site before the day crew arrived. Kyle told me about them with the casual appreciation of someone who doesn't yet know that not everyone gets this. When I was 16, I asked if I could come one Saturday. My father looked at me with genuine puzzlement, as though I had asked to attend something that simply didn't include girls, the way a men's locker room doesn't include girls. Not hostile, just categorically confused. He said, "What would you do at a job site?" I said I wanted to learn. He said, "You'd just be in the way." He said it without meanness, which was almost worse. It was a statement of fact as he understood facts, and the fact was that job sites were for Kyle, and by extension for futures like Kyle's. And my future, whatever it was, did not require the same foundations. I went to my room and I read for 3 hours, and I added the exchange to the long internal inventory I had been keeping since approximately age 10 of the ways the world of my family was organized and what my designated coordinates within it were. The educational disparity was structural and consistent. When Kyle struggled in his junior year with math, genuinely struggled, failing 2 tests in a row, the kind of failing that triggers parental involvement, my father hired a tutor. $30 an hour, twice a week. A college student named Brian from across town who came to the house and worked with Kyle at the kitchen table for a semester. Kyle passed. My father told the story of the tutoring as evidence that when a kid needed support, a good parent provided it. I was sitting at that same kitchen table doing my AP chemistry homework when he told this story to a neighbor, and I was not mentioned in the telling, which was accurate because I had never required a tutor, which was because I had never been provided one even in the one semester in 9th grade when I was genuinely struggling with geometry and had asked carefully whether that was something we could consider. My father had said, "Figure it out. That's what school is for." I figured it out. I taught myself from library books and a free tutoring program at the public library on Tuesday afternoons. I passed the class with a B-plus. I told no one that I was proud of this. The financial accounting of my childhood reads like a ledger that someone forgot to balance. My father contributed $2,400 to Kyle's first vehicle, a used Ford F-150, reliable, appropriate for the work Kyle was heading toward, presented with a handshake and the satisfaction of a man who saw his investment as sensible. When I turned 17 and mentioned that I was saving up for a car and had $800 so far from 2 years of babysitting and 1 summer of work at the Dairy Queen on Fort Campbell Boulevard, my father said, "Good. Work ethic. That's more valuable than any car." He contributed nothing. I drove my mother's Honda Civic on loan for 2 years, scheduling my life around her work schedule, and I did not complain about this because I had already internalized the accounting by 17 and understood that making the discrepancy visible would produce either dismissal or a lecture about the value of self-reliance that would somehow apply only to me. My mother helped where she could, in the quiet and rerouted way she helped everything. She gave me $200 from her private account for a winter coat my junior year when I needed one, and my father said coats were expensive, and I should have taken better care of last year's. She drove me to the SAT and the ACT without telling Dennis where we were going, saying instead that we had errands. She proofread my college application essays at the kitchen table after Dennis was in bed, her reading glasses on, her red pen making small, careful marks in the margins, her face carrying the specific brightness of a woman doing something she knows is right and knows she cannot do loudly. I applied to 7 colleges. I applied secretly with my mother's logistical support and the practical assistance of Mrs. Alcafor, who helped me with applications in her classroom during lunch periods and who wrote me a recommendation letter that she told me, with quiet emphasis, was the best she had written in 19 years of teaching. I did not tell my father I was applying. I did not tell Kyle. I told 2 friends, Brianna Holt and Cassie Moore, who kept the secret with the loyal seriousness of teenagers who understood that some information belonged only to the people it could hurt. The University of Tennessee's scholarship was the best offer. Full ride, 4 years. I had earned it with a 4.1 GPA, a 34 on the ACT, 2 years on the debate team, a summer volunteering program in Memphis, and 4 years of being the kind of student that teachers write their best recommendation letters for. I had earned it without tutors, without job site Saturdays, without $2,400 contributions to anything, without acknowledgement or celebration or anyone at home who treated my academic life as a thing deserving of investment. I had earned it entirely on my own, which was both a source of enormous pride and an indictment of an entire domestic system that I was still too young to fully name. My father tore it in half. And then he said something else that I have turned over in my mind for 20 years. After the tearing, after the 2 halves on the linoleum, after the statement about scams, he said, "You're a smart girl, Nadia. You can do something useful with that. Get a certification, become a dental hygienist like your mother, make a real living." He said my mother's career as an example of acceptable ambition. He said it without apparent awareness that he was telling his daughter that the ceiling of her aspiration should be the career of the woman he had spent 23 years making feel that her own ambitions required rerouting. I picked up both halves of the letter from the floor. I took them to my room. I taped them back together with Scotch tape, and I put the reconstructed letter in the back of my desk drawer behind a box of old birthday cards, and I sat on my bed and I made a decision that I have never fully articulated to anyone until now. I decided that I was leaving and that I was going, and that nothing in that house was going to be the last word on what I was worth or what I was capable of. I just had to figure out how. The summer after my father tore the letter was the longest of my life, and also, in retrospect, the most formative. 18 years old, a full academic scholarship that technically still existed somewhere in a university's system, regardless of what happened to its paper representation, living in a house where the subject of college had been closed with the finality of a door my father believed he had both the right and the authority to lock. My mother moved through those months with the specific, careful energy of a woman managing a situation she couldn't fully resolve, making my favorite dinners without being asked, finding small reasons to press money into my hand, speaking to me in the kitchen after Dennis had gone to bed in the low, urgent voice she used for real things. She said, on a night in late June, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her decaf coffee and her hands wrapped around the mug, "I need you to know that what he did with that letter was wrong. I need you to hear me say that plainly." I looked at my mother, 51 years old that summer, tired in the way she was always tired, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and I said, "Then why didn't you say something when he did it?" She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Because I've been saying things to your father for 23 years and learning which things he hears and which things he decides he doesn't." I said, "He decided he didn't hear this one." She said, "I know, baby. I'm sorry." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I let her, and we sat in the kitchen of the house where I had grown up being told my ambitions were acceptable only in certain shapes, and I understood my mother fully in that moment, her love and her limits, and the ways in which those 2 things had become so entangled that she could no longer easily separate them. I told her about the appeal. She looked at me without speaking. I had spent 2 weeks, quietly and methodically, researching what happened to a scholarship when the recipient didn't respond to the acceptance materials by the deadline. The answer, which I had confirmed in a phone call to the University of Tennessee's financial aid office from a payphone at the Walgreens on Fort Campbell Boulevard. I used a payphone because I was 18 and paranoid and my instincts were correct, was that the scholarship had a 30-day grace period for extenuating circumstances, after which it would be reassigned. The deadline for my response had been April 15th. It was now June 24th. The scholarship, as originally structured, was gone. But the financial aid officer I had spoken to, a woman named Deborah Marsh, who had the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had heard many difficult stories and had developed genuine tools for responding to them, had told me something else. She said that the University of Tennessee's Scholarship Committee reviewed appeals on a rolling basis through July 15th. She said that appeals based on documented family interference with educational access were taken seriously. She said that if I could provide written documentation, a statement from a school counselor, teacher, or other responsible adult, along with my own written account, the committee would review my case. She said she could not promise anything, but that my academic record was, in her words, the kind of record the committee looks for. I had not told my mother any of this because I had not decided until that night in June whether telling her was safe. She looked at me for a long time after I explained. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need Mrs. Okafor's contact information. I need you to write a statement if you're willing, and I need you not to tell Dad until it's done." My mother's jaw tightened in the specific way it tightened when she was making a decision that was going to cost her something. She said, "I'll write you a statement." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I've been not writing statements my whole marriage. I think it's time I wrote one." Mrs. Okafor's response to my phone call was immediate and unambiguous. She said, "Nadia Prescott, I have been waiting for this phone call since April. Tell me exactly what you need." I told her. She said she would have a letter to me within 48 hours and that it would be, in her words, the kind of letter that committees take seriously. She was not wrong. Mrs. Okafor's letter was 4 pages, single-spaced, documenting my academic history from 10th grade forward with the precision and passion of a woman who had been teaching for 21 years and had encountered perhaps a dozen students in that time whom she considered genuinely exceptional. I read it once in her classroom after school and had to sit very still for a moment before I trusted myself to fold it and put it in the envelope. My mother's statement was 2 pages. She wrote it by hand at the kitchen table over 3 nights after Dennis was asleep. She wrote about the scholarship, about the letter, about the phone call I had made that she hadn't known about at the time, about my academic record and my work history, and the specific and consistent ways in which my educational ambitions had been discouraged in our household while my brother's vocational trajectory had been actively supported. She wrote plainly and without bitterness, and with the clear-eyed accuracy of a woman who had decided that telling the truth about her family was the most loving thing she could do for her daughter in this particular moment. When she handed it to me, she said, "I don't know if this will work, but it's true, and you deserve for someone official to know the truth." I held the pages and I said, "Thank you, Mom." She said, "Don't thank me. I should have written this in April." I submitted the appeal on July 2nd, 2005. I drove myself to the FedEx office on Dover Road in my mother's Honda, and I overnighted the package. My statement, Mrs. Okafor's letter, my mother's statement, copies of my transcripts and test scores, to the University of Tennessee's Scholarship Committee office in Knoxville. The cost was $18.40. I paid it from my Dairy Queen savings, and then I waited. What I did while I waited requires its own accounting, because the waiting period was also when the second rupture happened. 3 weeks into July, on a Sunday afternoon, my father found the taped-together letter in my desk drawer. I had not hidden it well enough, or perhaps I had left it findable with some unconscious part of myself that understood a confrontation was eventually necessary and wanted to choose its timing. Dennis came downstairs with both pieces of taped-together paper in his hand and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has discovered that an instruction he gave was not fully followed. He said, "What is this?" I said, "I taped it back together." He said, "I told you." I said, "I know what you told me." This was the first time in my life that I had interrupted my father. The first time I had not waited for the end of his sentence before responding. He stopped. He looked at me with the recalibrated attention of a man reassessing something he thought he had resolved. I said, I submitted an appeal to the scholarship committee 3 weeks ago. I used Mrs. Okafor's recommendation and Mom's statement and my own account of what happened to the letter. I paused. I said, I'm waiting to hear back. The silence that followed lasted approximately 15 seconds, which is a long time for a silence in a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. My father looked at my mother, who was standing at the counter with her back to us, very still. Then he looked at me. His face went through several things: anger, which I expected, and then something more complicated, which I did not. Something that might have been the beginning of the understanding that the daughter he had been managing as a known quantity had developed in the months since April into something he hadn't fully planned for. He said, You went behind my back. I said, You tore up my scholarship. I went around the obstacle. He said, This is my house, and while you're in it. I said, I know, and I'm planning to not be in it for much longer. My father put the taped letter on the counter between us and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the back door open and close. My mother turned around from the counter and looked at me with an expression that contained, in equal measure, alarm and pride and the profound relief of a woman watching her daughter discover her own spine. The letter from the University of Tennessee's Scholarship Committee arrived on July 28, 2005. I was at work at the Dairy Queen when it came, and my mother called the store's landline and told me there was a letter and she hadn't opened it and I should come home as soon as my shift ended. I drove home in her Honda going exactly the speed limit, which was the most discipline I have ever exercised in my life, and I walked into the kitchen and the envelope was on the table and I sat down and I opened it. The scholarship committee had reviewed my appeal. They had taken into account the documentation provided. They had noted my academic record, my test scores, my letters of recommendation, and the written statements submitted on my behalf. They had determined that my case met the criteria for exceptional circumstance review. The full scholarship, all 4 years, $24,000 annually, room and board, full academic scholarship to the University of Tennessee College of Arts and Sciences, was reinstated with a revised acceptance deadline of August 10, 2005. I had 12 days. I read the letter twice. I folded it carefully. I put it in a new envelope, which I sealed, and I put my name on the outside and kept it on my person for the next 12 days because I was not taking any chances with paper in that house. My father and I did not speak directly for the remaining weeks of that summer. We moved around each other in the kitchen and the hallway with the careful, wide-berth courtesy of two people who have said the real things and are now managing the aftermath. My mother moved between us like a woman navigating a room with furniture rearranged in the dark, knowing where everything was, stepping carefully, not turning on the light. On August 8th, 2 days before the deadline, I signed the acceptance letter at the kitchen table while my mother watched. I mailed it at the post office on my lunch break. I came home and I told Dennis at dinner that it was done. He said nothing. He ate his food. He went to watch television. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. I squeezed back. On August 22nd, 2005, she drove me to Knoxville in the Honda with everything I owned that mattered in the back seat and the trunk. We didn't talk much on the drive. We didn't need to. When she helped me carry boxes up to my dorm room on the 3rd floor of Humes Hall and stood in the doorway looking at the small, standard-issue room with its 2 beds and its institutional furniture, and its window overlooking the quad, she said, "This is yours, Nadia." I said, "I know." She hugged me for a long time. Then she got in the Honda and she drove back to Clarksville, and I stood at the window of my dorm room and watched the parking lot empty out, and I let myself understand, fully and finally, that I had gotten out. The University of Tennessee was, without exaggeration or nostalgia, the place where I became myself. I say that not in the breathless way of someone whose college experience was primarily social, but in the specific and earned way of someone who arrived at a university at 18 with a taped-together letter and a Honda load of possessions and 4 years of institutional neglect to compensate for, and who spent 4 years compensating for it with a focused intensity that surprised even me. I studied business with a concentration in finance. The choice was not accidental. I had been doing the financial accounting of my family's differential treatment for years without naming it as such, and when I encountered actual financial theory in my first semester, something in me recognized it the way you recognize a language you grew up hearing but were never formally taught. Numbers had always made sense to me. The behavior of money, where it went, why, what it built, and what it withheld, made sense to me in a way that felt both intellectual and deeply personal. My professors noticed. My advisor, a woman named Dr. Sandra Yee, who had been teaching corporate finance for 18 years and had the direct, unsentimental manner of someone who respected effort above all else, told me at the end of my sophomore year that I was the strongest analytical mind in my cohort and that I should be thinking about graduate school. I thought about it. I applied. I was accepted to Vanderbilt's Owen Graduate School of Management with a partial merit scholarship in the spring of my senior year. I supplemented the scholarship with a graduate teaching assistantship that paid my living expenses. I graduated from UT in May of 2009 with a 3.94 GPA and a dean's citation for academic excellence, and I walked across that stage in Knoxville in the sunshine, and I thought about a kitchen in Clarksville and a letter in 2 pieces on the linoleum, and I thought, look, my mother was in the audience. My father was not. He had been invited. My mother had extended the invitation on my behalf. I had not been able to bring myself to extend it directly, which I have made a certain peace with since. Dennis had said he had a job running that weekend and couldn't get away. Kyle came, which I had not expected, and sat beside my mother in a UT folding chair in his good jeans, looking slightly uncomfortable and entirely genuine, and afterward he hugged me and said, "Nadia, this is a big deal." In the simple, direct way Kyle communicated the things he actually meant. I said, "I know." He said, "Dad should be here." I said, "I know that too." Kyle nodded. He looked at his shoes. He said, "He's wrong about a lot of things. I think he knows that on some level." I said, "Maybe, but knowing and saying are different things." Kyle nodded again. We went to lunch with my mother at a restaurant near campus, and we didn't talk about Dennis, and it was one of the better afternoons of my young adult life. I completed my MBA at Vanderbilt in 2011. I was 24 years old, and I had 2 degrees, 0 family financial contribution to either, and $14,000 in personal savings from a combination of assistantship income, careful spending, and a part-time bookkeeping job I'd held throughout graduate school for a small construction company in Nashville, which was in the specific irony that life occasionally produces, a family-owned residential construction firm, not entirely unlike the world my father had decided was the only world worth inhabiting. The owner of that firm, a woman named Gloria Tremaine, who had started the company with her husband in 1987 and taken it over alone after his death in 2003, became my first professional mentor and the first business person who looked at my brain and said, "Here is a problem. I believe you can solve it. I will get out of your way." I stayed at Tremaine Construction for 3 years after graduation, managing their financial operations and learning the construction industry from the inside in the specific way you can only learn an industry when you've also grown up adjacent to it. I understood the culture. I understood the language. I understood the particular combination of toughness and vulnerability that characterizes people who build things with their hands and who often, as a result, have complicated relationships with the parts of business that happen on paper. Gloria paid me fairly and told me clearly when I was ready to move on, which is the highest form of mentorship. I moved on in 2014. I joined a mid-size real estate development firm in Nashville called Paragon Group as a financial analyst. By 2017, I was their director of finance. By 2019, I was a vice president. By 2021, at the age of 34, I and 2 partners, a developer named Marcus Ellery and a contractor named Sonia Park, had spun out of Paragon to form our own development company, Elevate Properties, with an initial capitalization of $4.2 million, a portfolio of 3 projects in the Nashville metro area, and offices on the 14th floor of a building on Commerce Street that we had purchased a 31% stake in as part of our first major acquisition. Elevate Properties is now, in the spring of 2025, managing 11 active development projects across 3 states. Our current portfolio valuation is $47 million. I earn $310,000 annually in base salary plus equity distributions. I have a house in East Nashville that I bought in 2020, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a kitchen garden and good natural light, and I have paid my mortgage faithfully every month for 5 years without needing to ask anyone for anything. I tell you these numbers not to perform success, but because they matter to the story. They are the direct and specific consequence of a scholarship that was torn up and retrieved and used, and they represent the answer to the question my father was implicitly asking in 2005 when he said college was a scam. This is what the scam produces. These numbers, this floor, this window with this view of downtown Nashville. My father called me in December of 2024. I had not spoken to him in 14 months, which was not the longest gap in our history. We had gone 22 months without contact between 2011 and 2013, when something he said about my MBA that I will tell you about in the next section produced a rupture that took longer to bridge than either of us had planned. The December call came on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing project timelines at my desk, and I looked at his name on my phone screen for 3 full rings before I answered. He said, "Nadia." I said, "Dennis." We had been on first-name terms since 2013, which was another thing neither of us had formally decided and both of us had simply enacted. He said he was calling because he was in a difficult situation. He said the residential construction company he'd been working for, a firm in Clarksville he'd been with for 9 years, had downsized significantly in the fourth quarter of 2024 due to a combination of rising material costs and a slowdown in new residential starts in the Middle Tennessee market. He said he had been let go in November. He said he had been looking for comparable work and that the market was tight. He said he had been talking to Kyle, who had mentioned that my company was expanding and had active construction projects that required experienced site management. He said, "I was wondering if you might have something for someone with my experience." The silence that followed was mine, and I held it for a deliberate moment. Not to be cruel, I want to be honest about my own internal state in that moment, which was not triumphant and not cold and not simple in any direction. It was complicated in the way that all things involving 20 years of history and genuine love and genuine damage are complicated. I said, "Send me your resume, Dennis. I'll take a look." He sent it that night, and 3 weeks later, on a January morning in 2025, he came to the 14th floor of the building on Commerce Street, and he sat across from me in the conference room, and he slid his resume across the table with his work-roughened hands, and I looked at it for a long time without speaking. The confrontation I had been carrying for 20 years did not happen in a dramatic, cinematic way. There was no speech I had prepared, no moment of public reckoning in a room full of witnesses. It happened the way most real things happen, quietly, incompletely, in a room with 2 people and a great deal of history between them and a piece of paper on a table. I said, "Your experience is solid. You know construction management at a level that would be genuinely useful to us. Marcus Ellery, my partner who oversees site operations, would be your direct manager. I would not be your day-to-day supervisor." I paused. I said, "I need you to understand something before we go further. If you come to work here, you work for this company. Not for me specifically, but for this company that I helped build. You follow the same protocols and reporting structures as everyone else. Your relationship to me outside this office does not give you special standing inside it." He nodded. He said, "I understand." I said, "I also need to say something that isn't about the job." He looked at me. I said, "You tore up a letter that I had earned. You made a decision about my future based on a philosophy that was more about protecting your own worldview than about what was actually best for me. I went around you, and I'm glad I did, and I've been glad every day since. I'm not saying this to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because I need the record to be accurate between us before we try to work together." Dennis was quiet for a long time. He looked at the conference table. He looked at the window behind me with its 14th floor view of Nashville. He said, "I know." 2 words, clean and plain. I said, "Is that all?" He said, "I don't know how to say it better than that yet." I know what I did was wrong. I know what you built without me. I'm not going to pretend those two things don't have a connection. I said, they do. He said, I know. He looked at me, finally, directly, with the eyes of a man carrying something heavy, and knowing he has to carry it further before he can put it down. He said, I'm proud of you, Nadia. I should have said that years ago. I don't expect it to fix anything. I looked at my father across the conference table. I was 38 years old, and he was 59, and the Honda Civic was 20 years ago, and the linoleum was 20 years ago, and the taped letter was 20 years ago. I said, it doesn't fix anything, but it matters that you said it. He nodded. I said, I'll talk to Marcus about the position. You'll hear from HR by the end of the week. He stood. He picked up his resume from the table. I slid it back to him. We had our own copy. And he put it in his jacket pocket and he said, Thank you for seeing me. I said, You're welcome. He walked to the conference room door and opened it and then stopped, and without turning around, he said, She was right, you know, Mrs. Okafor, whatever she put in that letter. I said, I know. She told me the same thing. He nodded. He left. I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after he was gone, looking at the window and the Nashville skyline beyond it and the particular quality of a January afternoon in Tennessee, thin lit and cold and oddly clarifying. I thought about a kitchen and a letter and a payphone at a Walgreens and a woman named Deborah Marsh at a financial aid office who had taken a phone call from an 18-year-old girl who had figured out how to route herself around an obstacle. And I thought about everything that had been built from that rerouting, floor by floor, decision by decision, over 20 years. Then I picked up my phone and called Marcus Ellery and said, I need to talk to you about a site manager position. It is September of 2025 now, 8 months since Dennis Prescott sat in a conference room on the 14th floor and slid his resume across a table his daughter had helped buy. And I want to tell you what the landscape looks like from here. Not the dramatic landscape of confrontations and revelations, but the ordinary, daily landscape of a life built on the other side of everything that happened. Because the ordinary landscape is where you actually live, and I think it deserves as much honest accounting as the dramatic parts. Dennis got the job. I want to say that plainly and early because I know it's the thing you're waiting to find out, and I don't want to make you wait for it the way I was made to wait for things I had already earned. Marcus Ellery interviewed him in February, evaluated his experience and references with the thorough and unsentimental efficiency that Marcus brings to everything, and determined that Dennis Prescott was genuinely qualified for the site management role on our Brentwood residential development project, a 40-unit townhome complex that was our most logistically complex active build. Marcus called me after the interview and said, He knows what he's doing. I'd like to bring him on. I said, Then bring him on. Marcus said, You're sure? I said, I'm sure. Just make sure he understands the reporting structure clearly. Marcus said, Already done. That was the full extent of the professional discussion. Dennis started in March. He has been, by Marcus's assessment and the project records I review in my normal course of business, a good site manager. Experienced, practical, respected by the crews, someone who shows up before the first laborer arrives and stays until the last problem of the day is resolved. He does not seek me out at the office. He does not use our relationship as a corridor to special access or lenient standards. He reports to Marcus. He attends the site review meetings. He does his job. This is both what I required and what I genuinely hoped for. And the fact that he has delivered it has produced in me a complicated and real respect that I did not anticipate with full clarity when I made the decision to hire him. We have had 3 conversations that were not about work since he started. The first was in April when he came to my office on a Friday afternoon and asked if I had 10 minutes. I said I did. He sat down and he said, I've been working on the Brentwood project for 6 weeks now and I want you to know something. I said, What? He said, Every decision on that project, the engineering calls, the material selections, the sequencing, it's all been made by people with degrees, good degrees, from good schools. And they've been right, consistently, and I've been watching that and thinking about 2005. He stopped. He said, I was wrong about college being a scam. I was wrong specifically about your college. I was wrong to tear that letter. I said, Yes, You were. He said, I know sorry doesn't. I said, it doesn't undo it. But I want you to know that I went anyway, and everything that came from going is mine, and you not being there for it is also yours to carry. Both those things are true. He nodded. He said, I know. He left. I sat at my desk for a few minutes and let the conversation be what it was, which was incomplete and real and more than I had gotten from him in 38 years of being his daughter. The second conversation was in June, when I called him. Which was a reversal of the historical pattern I made deliberately and with full awareness of what it meant. I called him because my mother Linda had told me on our Sunday call that Dennis had said something to her that she thought I should know about. She said he had told her that he understood now why she had written the statement for the scholarship appeal. He said he had been angry about it for years. He said he wasn't angry anymore. He said she had done the right thing. My mother had cried telling me this, not dramatically, but in the quiet, releasing way of a woman setting down something she'd been carrying for a long time. I called Dennis and I said, Mom told me what you said to her. He said, I should have said it a long time ago. I said, yes, but you said it. There was a long pause. He said, she's a good woman. I said, she is. She always was. He said, I know that too. We talked for 12 minutes about nothing in particular after that. The Brentwood project, the weather, a fishing trip he was planning in October, and it was the most ordinary conversation I had ever had with my father, which made it, in its way, the most extraordinary. The third conversation happened in August, and this one I did not initiate and did not expect. I was working late on a Thursday, the building quieter than its daytime self, and Dennis knocked on my open office door at 6:15. He had been at a late site meeting that ran long. He looked tired in the physical, uncomplicated way of a man who had spent the day doing demanding work. He said, Can I say something? I said, Yes. He said, I've been thinking about something you said in January, in the conference room. I said, What part? He said, You said you went around me and you've been glad every day since. I said, I meant it. He said, I know. I've been thinking about what it took to do that. At 18, with no one at home who was helping you. He paused. He said, I was supposed to be the one helping you. That was my job. I wasn't doing my job. I looked at my father in the doorway of my office, and I thought about 18 and the payphone and the FedEx envelope and the 12 days and the Honda and the drive to Knoxville. I said, No, you weren't. He said, I'm sorry for that, Nadia. Specifically and directly, I'm sorry. I said, I hear you. He said, That's enough for tonight. He said goodnight and went to the elevator, and I heard it arrive and the doors close, and I sat in my office in the quiet building, and I let the apology be real. It is not everything. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think clean resolutions are a form of lying, and I have been telling you the truth this entire time, and I am not going to stop at the end. Dennis Prescott saying sorry does not return the years I spent building without a foundation, does not put back the scholarship letter, does not give me the Saturday job sites or the tutor or the $2,400 toward a truck. The accounting of what was given and what was withheld does not balance simply because someone finally acknowledges the discrepancy. I know this. I have known this since long before he came to my office. What it does is change the current and future ledger. It changes what our relationship is made of now and going forward. It changes whether Dennis is a man I am managing from a distance or a person I am genuinely, if carefully and with appropriate protective instincts, allowing back into my life in the form it can now take. Those are not small changes. They are real ones, and I receive them as real. Let me tell you where everyone else is, because you deserve the full picture. My mother Linda retired from the dental practice on Madison Street in March of 2025 after 31 years of steady and uncelebrated service that produced an income that quietly kept our family's practical life functioning. She is 68 years old, and she is, for what I believe, is the first time in her adult life in possession of her full days. She has taken up watercolor painting, which she does at a small table she set up in the spare bedroom of the house she still shares with Dennis. And she is, by her own account and the photographic evidence she texts me regularly, genuinely good at it. She painted a series of 6 small landscapes of the Kentucky Lake area this summer that she sent me in a package with a note that said, "I always wanted to do this. Turns out 68 wasn't too late to start." I have one of the landscapes on the wall of my home office in East Nashville. It is the first piece of art I have ever owned that came from someone in my family, and I look at it every morning. My mother and I speak every Sunday. We have spoken every Sunday since I left for Knoxville in August of 2005, which is 20 years of Sunday calls, which is the most consistent thing in my adult life and the relationship I am most grateful for. She has told me things in the years since the scholarship appeal and since Dennis's employment at Elevate that she could not tell me while I was in that house, and she was managing the gap between what she felt and what she could safely say. She told me last spring that writing the statement in 2005 was the bravest thing she had ever done. She said it took her years to stop feeling guilty about it. I said, "You saved my life with that statement, Mom." She said, "You saved your own life. I just handed you a piece of paper." I said, "Sometimes a piece of paper is everything." She said, "I know. I watched your father learn that lesson the hard way." We both laughed, which is not something my mother and I could have done about Dennis 5 years ago, and the fact that we can now is its own form of progress. Kyle is 40 years old and working as a foreman for a commercial construction company in Clarksville, senior enough to be respected, experienced enough to be good at it, settled in the particular way of someone who found his path early and has walked it steadily. He and I are genuinely close now, closer than we were for most of our adult lives. He called me when he heard Dennis had come to Nashville for the interview, and he said, "How do you feel about it?" I said, "Complicated." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I want you to know that I know it wasn't fair. Growing up, the way things were divided between us." I said, "I know you know. I've known for a while." He said, I want to say it out loud. It wasn't fair and you handled it better than I would have." I said, "You don't know that." He said, "I do, actually. I know exactly how I would have handled it, which is not as well." I said, "You're handling it fine now, Kyle." He said, "Thanks, Nadia." We talk every few weeks. He comes to Nashville occasionally for dinner, and we sit in my kitchen in East Nashville and talk about real things, and it is one of the better friendships I have in my adult life, which is a sentence I could not have written 10 years ago. Dr. Sandra Yee, my Vanderbilt advisor, is now 71 and recently retired. She sent me a note when Elevate Properties was featured in the Nashville Business Journal in 2023. A short, characteristic note on her personal stationery that said, "I told you, SY." I have that note in my desk drawer. I take it out occasionally. I find it reliably bracing. Mrs. Patricia Okafor retired from teaching in 2018 and lives in Memphis. I found her in 2022 through the school's alumni network, and I sent her a letter that took me 3 drafts to write because nothing I wrote felt adequate to what she had done. She wrote back and said that my letter was the finest thing she had received in her retirement and that she had known from the October of my sophomore year that I would build something real, and she was glad to see she'd been right. I called her after the letter and we talked for an hour and a half, and I cried twice and she did not because Patricia Okafor has the constitution of a woman who has been right about things for a long time and has made her peace with the cost of that. Gloria Tremaine, my first mentor, is 78 and still nominally active at Tremaine Construction in an advisory capacity. I have lunch with her twice a year. She orders the same thing every time, a club sandwich and unsweetened iced tea, and she asks sharp, specific questions about Elevate's operations and gives me assessments that are more useful than half the professional consulting I pay for. She said to me at our last lunch in July, "You know what your best quality is, Nadia?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "You never forgot what it cost. Some people succeed and they build a mythology about it that erases the cost. You never did. You kept the receipt." I thought about that for a long time afterward. She was right. I have kept every receipt. I want to speak now to the specific person this story is for, and I think you know who you are if you've been reading this closely. You are the girl whose future someone tore up. Maybe literally, maybe metaphorically. The ripping takes different forms, but the mechanism is the same. Someone with authority over your life looked at what you were reaching for and decided, for reasons that were always more about them than about you, that you should reach less far or in a different direction, or not at all. And they had the power to enact that decision, at least temporarily, and so they did. And you absorbed it, or you fought it, or you did what I did, which was both: absorb it in the moment and fight it later, from a different angle, with the specific patience of someone who has learned that direct confrontation with a locked door is less effective than finding the window. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know at 18. The people who tear up your letters are usually afraid. Not of you specifically, but of what you represent, a standard they didn't meet, a path they didn't take, an implicit judgment that they read into your ambition even when you intend no judgment at all. My father's philosophy about college being a scam was, at its core, a defense mechanism built to protect a man who had not gone to college from having to reckon with what he might have built if he had. My ambition threatened that defense not because I was attacking him, but because I existed. I was present in his house with my test scores and my AP classes and my letter from the University of Tennessee, and my presence required him to either celebrate what I was doing or find a reason to diminish it. He found a reason. That is the most honest explanation I have, and I have spent 20 years arriving at it. Understanding why someone hurt you does not obligate you to excuse it. That is a distinction I wish someone had handed me clearly at 18 instead of letting me arrive at it piecemeal over 2 decades. You can understand the mechanism of a wound without deciding the wound was acceptable. You can have compassion for the fear behind someone's cruelty without pretending the cruelty wasn't real. Both things can be true. Both things are true in my story. I understand my father and I do not excuse what he did, and those two things coexist in me every day without resolving into a simpler feeling, and I have made my peace with the complexity. Here is what else I know. The path you build by going around the obstacle is often stronger than the path you would have built if the obstacle hadn't been there. Not because adversity is secretly a gift. I reject that framing, which I find both sentimental and insulting to the real cost of real difficulty, but because going around an obstacle requires you to develop capacities that a clear path doesn't demand. I learned to route myself quietly and methodically. I learned to build coalitions. Mrs. Okafor, my mother, Deborah Marsh at the financial aid office, without broadcasting what I was building. I learned to keep going after something had been declared over, because things declared over by someone who doesn't have the final authority over your life are not actually over. I learned all of this from being 18 and having a letter torn in half in a kitchen in Clarksville, and I have used every single lesson in the 20 years since. I want you to know that the payphone at the Walgreens is available to you. I mean that both literally and as a metaphor. The route around exists. The Deborah Marshes of the world, the patient, unhurried people in institutional offices who take calls from young women who have figured out that the rules contain a provision for their situation if they know where to look, are there. The Mrs. Okafors are there. The procedure exists. The appeal process exists. The FedEx envelope exists. The 12 days exist. What is required from you is the willingness to go looking for the route with the same energy you would have spent being stopped by the obstacle. You are not what someone else decided about your future. You are what you build from the decision to keep going anyway. And the building takes time, and it is not always linear, and there will be years when the conference room feels impossibly far from the kitchen. And then one day, you will be sitting in it and someone will slide a piece of paper across the table and you will understand, completely and without drama, that you have arrived somewhere real. Please like and subscribe if this story found you at the right moment, and only if it genuinely did. Drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are. And tell me this: has someone in your life torn up something you earned? Did you find the route around? I want to know. Your story belongs in the record too, and I am here to read it. There are more videos in the description for anyone who needs to keep going tonight.